Annabelle has so much to say, and I know you'd a whole lot rather hear what she's got to say than what I have to say. She started last month talking about the Franklin Creighton gold mines. And for those of you who were here, I know you were very tickled to hear about that and learn a lot more about the history. I've lived here all my life and learned a lot from last month. So she's going to come on a little bit later. Her mom, Sammy's going to come on and give an overview of last month for those of you who were not here, and give us an overview of what Annabelle talked about. And then Annabelle's going to come on and tell us a little bit more about the Woodrow Wilson connection to the Cherokee gold mines. So I'm going to step aside, and Sammy, if you want to come forward and get started with our program.
Contemplated how to narrow down this vast information that has occurred by living in that area for so many years, and how to present it in just a short while. And then we're reminded a lot of people tonight weren't here last meeting. So how do you go back and recoup so much of what was discussed? But basically, we've tried to just give a few facts in review. Cherokee Indians mined gold here on the Pasco property. There were some deep cratered holes, and we were told by older people that was Indian pit mines. I don't know any details about it, but it was done before the county was actually chartered. And even before the county was chartered, settlers began to come in and mine on their own without really having owned the land they were on, which brought us back to the story about the widow Franklin. You want to tell us a little bit?
The two main miners that first started making a significant amount of money mining up in the northeastern corner of Cherokee County, up on Yellow Creek Road. The address is Ball Ground, so we're in the Ball Ground area, was the widow Franklin and John Pasco. And the widow Franklin had drawn a lot of land because her husband was a war veteran. And she hadn't even gone out to see her lot of land, but she heard rumors that there were squatters mining her lot of land. So she came in. There's stories about her coming in on a mule, and that she was an impoverished woman, but my research isn't showing that the impoverishment was true. She wasn't impoverished. But she came in, hired a gunslinger to chase the squatters off her land. And she set up a very profitable mine there.
She was granted by the legislature the right to build a dam on the river. And from that became a lot of different sawmill, milling process, and so forth, and then eventually power.
The Pasco mine was on the southern side of the Etowah River, right where Yellow Creek Road crosses the Etowah River. You can see the shingle house in the field there that was the general store for the mine and the assayer's office for the mine. On the northern side of the Etowah River was the Pasco mine, and that was my father's ancestors. He's descended from Samuel Pasco. And the Pascos were running that mine, the Franklins were running the other mine, and then when the head of the Pasco family passed away in the 1800s, and Franklins had moved on, the mines were consolidated. And the consolidated mines operate under many different names. They would come in and have investors come in and take over the mines, and each investor would change the name. They were the Creighton mines when Mr. Creighton owned the mines. And you see that name on a lot of the roads, Creighton mines. You see it on some other things. There were the consolidated mines for a little while. They were the standard mines for a little while.
At that time, they emphasized pyrite and power.
Right. And then in the early 1900s, the Franklin name was revived, and it was the Franklin mines again. But when you see the references to the Franklin mines in the 1900s, that's the Pasco and Franklin mines from the 1800s consolidated. And last month, we had pictures of all these miners for you, and I brought the pictures of the actual mines that I've accumulated, and we did a summary of what we discovered about the mines. Mom dug up some facts for you about the Pascos. We've got mint records, and just from 1843 to 1851, John Pasco had deposited gold that totaled up to $11,840.
They said the men in Dahlonega.
And his brother had deposited gold that totaled up to $7,076. And that's in 1840s. So imagine how much money that would be worth today. And the Pasco mine, Franklin mine was even more profitable than that. So
And
that
what-
gives you an idea. The Franklin mine was considered, when you're talking about the 1900s Franklin mine, that was the consolidation, the longest continuously operated mine in Georgia. They exceeded the mines in Dahlonega as far as the time period that they were continuously operating. The mines in Dahlonega had more mines, may have had some more profitable mines, but they closed down, reopened, closed down, and reopened. But the Franklin was considered the longest continually operating. Our connection to the mines, I grew up playing on the mines. My dad grew up playing on the mines and hearing his grandfather tell him stories about the mine because his grandfather worked in the mines. My mother and her sister Vivian grew up in the home that was John Pasco's home on the mines. Their father purchased the mine in the 1950s, 1955. Oh, purchased the home,
House, not the mine.
the homes, and they grew up in that home. And when I was little, I always thought it was interesting that my grandmother on my mama's side lived with the ghost of my ancestors on my daddy's side. Mom was going to tell you a little bit about her home.
The house, well, as far as mining, we have pictures here, and we have some of the geological surveys that go into detail about the shafts, number of shafts, the tunnels, the depth, the type, ore, and so forth, because it's just too much in detail to cover in one night. There's a sketch of a map here showing basically where the pyrite and the gold is mined. And pyrite was mined especially and used before World War I for fertilizer. On the records, a lot of the mining company was selling it to a fertilizer company. But then later during World War I, it was used for gunpowder. Okay, John Pasco, we talked a good bit about last week, and he first mined in Dahlonega. We've got records we have of letters to John C. Calhoun where he and his brother Samuel at least mine and were mining, but not up to the speed that John C. Calhoun's advisor felt like they should, and they were trying to figure out how to kick them out of this lease or break the lease. And he ended up eventually coming to Cherokee County, and he's the one that started and built the home that we live in. Pasco House, most people refer to it as the Pasco House. He was a mining engineer from Cornwall, England, and he purchased the land there from Jabez Holcomb and began construction on the house about 1847, 45. But now, as I get into it a little bit later, some of the resource surveys think the house was there earlier, or part of it anyway. John Pasco died in 1853. He inhaled mercury vapors in trying to use the new technique with mercury to filter the gold, and it killed him. And after he had willed the place to his brother Samuel in Dahlonega, and there was a big court case over that in Cherokee County records because neither one of them were naturalized. They were English citizens. And after the court litigation, Samuel, his brother, bought the home in 1854 in front of the courthouse. The land, all in that area, was part of the Franklin Pasco Creighton mines. The Pasco home was used as a home for mining administrators and their families through the years. So therefore you have, as we've lived here many years, we've had many people come and say, well, my ancestor lived there in certain time. And on the maps, it shows the house as the administrator's, manager's home. When the mining slowed down, Dr. George McClure, the mine's doctor, bought the house and the land around it. And then in 1955, Sammy Leslie, my father, bought the home from Dr. Wilson McClure, Dr. George McClure's son. And I don't know, a lot of you in Ballground knew the McClures, but Wilson passed away about 2 years ago, is that right? He would come to visit and tell us about a lot of the old times. John Leslie, Sam's oldest son, purchased the home from his father, and in 1998, he sold it to Don and myself. The home was surveyed in 1976 and resurveyed in 1988 by a historic resource professional from the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. Now, I think the first time it was instigated by maybe Catherine Malone, I don't know. They wanted someone professionally to look it over. And then later, I think the Historical Society in 1988 wanted another person to analyze the value of the history in it. At that time, in 88, it was estimated that original construction was in 1836. You know, well, the Indians' Trail of Tears was 1838, 37, 38. Although John Pascoe bought the site in 1845, the house was described in this survey as a Greek revival cottage style, with 4 large rooms, a large hall, front and back porches, and 3 rooms and a hall upstairs. Early features are the front and rear double doors with full transom and side lights, and they're still in place. Originally, the home had a connecting breezeway to a cookhouse. You know, some of the earliest homes, these historic homes you visited, had a dog trot.
You can see the cookhouse right here,
But this,
and then the breezeway connecting the
by
home to
that
the cookhouse.
chimney on the left there was like, almost like a hall. It's covered and enclosed. Now, when Dr. McClure bought it, he had that made into a bathroom with a huge Victorian type tub with feet and the little water closet with
The
the floor chain. It was a treasure. Originally, the cookhouse, as you see it there, was part of it, but it was moved when Samuel Pascoe's daughter married, and when it was moved, she made it a home. In 1999, a historical survey by Tommy Jones, a restoration architect, emphasized in his report the evolution of the home over time. He said it shows, he would analyze the type nails in certain parts of the construction, the type under the house. Some of it was hand hewn, some of it looked like it had been with a saw, you know, a sawmill. One of the features, and I didn't put it here, was the stairway. It had a huge sideboard down the stairs that you can see where the hand plane marks are. Miss Yarborough, when she'd come to visit with her homemade teacher's visit, she says, "Oh, I just love that staircase." He said the mortise, tinian, peg connections was in the first work, while the interior pegged hand plane doors, and they call them cross doors. Bullock Hall in Roswell has some just like them. They were a later addition, like after the Civil War. The 4 chimneys of the local handmade brick, and we think we found where they made them down the hill from the homes, big clay bank and a lot of mounds of chipping, so we feel like they were made probably on the land during the construction. But they were pulled down in 1956 when my dad bought the place, because a lot of them were deteriorating. And out of 4 chimneys, they took the very best and built 2 back. Alterations of the flooring and the windows were needed improvements in 56. Had to have a new roof. A lot was done in order to move our family there, but like we put the wrong type windows in, and it's hard to find that style that was probably there. The restoration architect said it was probably 6/6. And we haven't replaced them. We thought we had the right windows and they were too wide. So we're still planning on that. Pasco descendants have reported the beautiful cherry mantle in the parlor was brought to the site when John Pasco started construction. In later years, the exterior and interior has been painted several times. Renovation in the upstairs and kitchen was begun but put on hold due to a period of poor health by Don and myself. And the roof's been replaced several times. Originally, in fact, working upstairs, there were some shingles that I think are original handmade shingles, showing that probably the first roof was shingled, and then later tin, and then now the last few additions were asphalt shingles. From the back porch, which went all the way across the home, this was renovated to make a large kitchen, a bathroom, and a small bedroom. It was framed up. And so many people have descended from the original builder and his brother's family. He brought 12 children there. So through the years, we've met so many. They come by and tell us stories that were passed down through their
Also,
families.
you've had descendants of their slaves
Yeah, we had
Come.
some of the
to
descendants
tell stories that
came
their
and said
ancestors have
they
passed down.
built the rock wall, and they just wanted to see the place. And what it's leading up to, we had for a while a Pasco White organization and had reunions, and here's some of the newsletters there. One of them, the first volume I think is in here, describes when they auctioned the house when the first occupant, John, died. His brother Samuel had to go to court and buy it from the sale on the courthouse, but all the items in the minute book are documented that are sold and who bought them and how much they paid. So that part was really interesting, a treasure find. Now, that leads us up to some of Annabelle's worked a lot
I
of
promised you last week.
time on this. Let me get out
I
of here.
promised you last week the greatest love story I've ever discovered. My grandmother was the most magical person that I think has ever walked this earth. And I grew up hearing a combination of ghost stories and love stories from her, sitting in this home where even if you don't believe in ghosts, you can feel, you can just sense that history's all around you. And a lot of it she would come up with from things people told her that visited. But I always wondered if she had ghosts whispering in her ear sometimes to help her out with some of these stories, because she always knew more than any history book could ever tell you. When Mom started, it was just when she first had one of the historical architects come to visit her house, I printed out the paperwork to start working on the historical register. And I wanted to know as many people that had lived in her house as possible. Well, one name that had been batted around, some people saying he lived there, some people said no, he didn't live there, was Woodrow Wilson's brother-in-law. And when we first heard him mentioned, we didn't hear his name. We just knew the brother-in-law of President Wilson may have lived in this house. We knew that the brother-in-law of President Wilson had been the superintendent of the Franklin gold mines in the 1900s. So I was trying to find, I wanted to prove whether he lived in my mama's house or not. And that adventure has taken me all over the country in a way. The first research I did was at the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library. No, was at the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library's website in their virtual archives. And they have got correspondences where people have written letters to Woodrow Wilson, to Woodrow Wilson's wife, and to Woodrow Wilson's children. And my very first grand discovery was a letter that Edward wrote to his niece Jessie. And I'm reading just a little excerpt, and I'm going to try to read fast. I suppose you are having a delightful, cool summer in Canada. We've had some hot weather here, but most of the summer has been quite comfortable, and the nights are invariably cool. Our house is up on a hill, overlooking the river, so we get any breeze that is stirring. And with its wide veranda and hallway, it is just the kind of house for summer. Master Edward Stockton, that's his baby, is walking now, and he makes voyages of discovery all about it. The front porch has a railing, and a baby gate, so it is just the place for him, except that everything he can make go through or over the railing lands in the grass. But he has learned how to open the screen door now, and the other day he slipped away and went out to the end of the back porch where there is no railing at all. And there his mother found him laughing and calling to her in triumph. He started upstairs one day and was halfway up before he was discovered. He can scamper about quite as fast now, though his progress is often interrupted by a forward plunge or a backward sit down. In this letter, he had to be describing my mom's house, because it's the only house I can think of that sits up on top of a hill looking down at the river. Most of the homes were built down on the river bottom land. There were several mine-owned homes that were built in that area. Mom's house has a huge front porch going all the way across the front and a huge back porch going all the way across the back with a big hall going down the center. The most magical part when I was reading this was my memories, because me and all of my cousins would sit on that front porch and throw things through the rails. And I can remember one time I would throw things to the rails and my cousin would dare me to try to climb over and jump down to get it, which is a huge porch, and my grandmother saying, if you break something, I'm not going down there to get you. And the stairs, going up those stairs and trying to investigate parts of the house that aren't in use. And so that was the first thing I found that pretty much confidently connected Edward to my mother's home. Then I found myself going to Emory University. They've got on microfilm all kinds of loose papers from Woodrow Wilson's collection. Found a great discovery there was 3 years worth of diaries, of Edward's diary. I went to the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library in Virginia. Again, found boxes and boxes and boxes of notes and letters and stuff dealing with Edward Axon. Mother and I flew up to New Jersey, to Princeton University. Woodrow Wilson was the president of Princeton University when Edward was writing letters to him from Franklin. And these letters would have the letterhead, Franklin Mining Company, Creighton, Georgia, Edward Axon, Superintendent. And they would be written to President Woodrow Wilson, Princeton, New Jersey. And Mom and I were nearly in tears. We spent 3 days in Princeton probably. And we would put in a request for the first box of loose papers Woodrow Wilson collection. And they would bring a box. If you picture if somebody had taken, if you had passed away and they'd gone into your study and pulled out one of your file cabinet drawers and dumped it in a box, that was the type thing we're digging through. We even found some of Woodrow Wilson's check stubs in the little stapled together. We nearly went crazy when we found the picture that we have back there of Edward Axon's uncle, is Woodrow Wilson's wife's uncle, sitting on the steps that go up to my mother's home with Edward Axon's son sitting next to him. And then the picture that's beside that one, where you see a man in a boat, that's Edward Axon. And on the back of the picture, it had written in handwriting, Edward Axon, Etowah River, Creighton, Georgia. And then in the, I think it might be over to the right, you can see an older couple. That's Edward Axon's aunt and uncle, Warren Brown and Louisa Brown, sitting in my mother's front yard in front of a bay tree that is still there. And in fact, our family has this little tradition every Easter. We take a grandchildren picture sitting on the steps. And then we take a picture of my mom and dad with the grandchildren around them under that bay tree, because they have a bench under the bay tree. So it was like I was in a time machine, looking in time, and then I was sitting in President Wilson's presidential library, and these pictures were in boxes that included his check stubs. Well, I promised you a love story, and I'm not there yet. The connection to Woodrow Wilson and Edward is even stronger than I'd ever imagined it. I started researching Edward's whole life and putting everything in chronological order. Edward Axon's dad was a Presbyterian pastor in Rome, Georgia. His children are spaced about almost 8 years between each of the children. He had Ellen Axon first, who is Woodrow Wilson's wife, and she is 20 years older than Edward, her younger brother. Edward Axon was about 6 years old when his younger sister was born, Margaret, and her mother died of childbirth fever a few weeks after she was born. Ellen Axon had already gone to college, and she was studying art in New York at this time period. Their brother Stockton was off at college. The only people at home at that time period was Edward Axon and his baby sister Margaret, who'd just been born. So Edward Axon was sent to live with an uncle in Maysville, Georgia, and his little sister was sent to live with Aunt Louisa, that's in those pictures, in Gainesville, Georgia. Sometime that time period, Edward developed a stutter. And this stutter in his writing is mentioned over and over and over again. Edward wasn't reunited with his siblings until about 10 years later, when Woodrow Wilson's second child was born. Ellen came to Gainesville to give birth to each of her first two babies. Traditions back then, and some of you may have had this as your tradition when you were giving birth, a woman would go back to her mother's home to give birth so that she would have her mom there to help her out. Well, Ellen didn't have a mother, so she went to her aunt's home in Gainesville. And this time they were living in Bryn Mawr College up north where Woodrow Wilson was president. I want to say Connecticut. And she came to Gainesville to give birth. She wanted to bring Edward back with her after the first baby, but her aunt and uncle talked her out of it because she'd only been married a year. And they said, you and Woodrow need to have just you and your baby. When she came back to give birth to her second baby, there was no talking her out of it. And she took Edward with her to live with Woodrow Wilson. And from when Edward was about 10 years old until he graduated from college, he lived with he called Ellen's sister in his writing. He never said her name, he just said sister. And he called Woodrow Brother Woodrow. So for a good bit of his life, Brother Woodrow was his father figure because he lived in the home with him. In Edward's writing, one of the first writing I found was before he had moved there was his grandfather writing a letter telling him for every week he could go without stuttering, his grandfather would send him $1. He said, I'll send you a gold coin. And he said, eventually you'll have enough money to buy a bicycle. Another report had Edward saving up to buy a bicycle about 4 years after that. So I'm assuming he never went the amount of time he needed to go without stuttering to earn the money to buy that bicycle. Right after Edward moved in with Ellen and Woodrow, they sent him to an institute. And he sent letters. I just realized I skipped Samuel Axon. Their father committed suicide in Milledgeville after their mother was born. That's a whole other topic. I should have told you that. But they sent him to an institute. And when he's writing about this institute, he's talking about a 21-year-old lady severely deformed who's receiving therapy. He's talking about a boy that has been in a horrific flood and had not spoken in 5 years. So it sounds like he was really in an institute with some people with some major impairments, and he was there to be treated for his stuttering. And that was in Philadelphia. And one of the things that was done in this institute, and he writes a letter describing it, and he said, don't worry, it didn't hurt too bad, was just like a pinch and a burning, was they removed part of each of his tonsils. Was one of the things they had done with the stuttering. Then he returned to Woodrow Wilson's home. He went to Princeton University. And in his diaries at Princeton, he talks about some great adventures, very much a college boy's life, but he keeps going back to the stuttering. And while I was reading about all of this, I was a school teacher. And I thought about my children growing up with a mother as a school teacher. And anybody that's been raised by a school teacher, you're drilled into you about proper speaking and all of that. Well, Edward's being raised by Woodrow Wilson, who is a college professor. And his brother Stockton is a college professor. His daddy was a Presbyterian minister. Both of his grandfathers were Presbyterian ministers. So living in this world where you're surrounded by amazing speakers who make their living off of speaking, and you're plagued with a stutter, probably seems even worse. Well, while he was at Princeton, the main way that they were graded was based on their recitations. And he was required to memorize text, and you never would know when you're going to be called up. In his diary, he would write, called up in Mr. Corn's class today, and it was humiliating. Called up for recitation in so-and-so's class today, and it did not go well. And one of his professors was Professor Corn, and he really seemed to enjoy humiliating Edward. So one of his diary entries, which was, I read it as a teacher at first and got really mad at Edward. Then I read it as the student that seemed like the teacher was zeroing in on him. He tells of him stealing a chicken on the way to school, and he hides it under his hat. This is in 1893. And he sits down in Professor Corn's classroom with his chicken hidden, and in the middle of the class, he lifts up the hat and shoos the chicken out to Professor Corn. And then all the students start chasing this chicken around. And then he talks about Professor Corn beating him with his cane. And that was some of the things I ran into with Edward there. He graduates from Princeton. He has a degree in chemistry. And then he went and he worked in a locomotive factory in Philadelphia. And I found letter after letter that he has written to his nieces, talking about working on a train that was being built for the Tsar of Russia. And those are dated in 1898. From there, he went to MIT, and he got his master's from MIT. And after MIT, he came back to Princeton and was expected to be a professor at Princeton. His brother was a professor at Princeton by then. His brother-in-law, Woodrow, was a dean of students at Princeton. But Edward was a total failure as a professor at Princeton. He didn't even last a month until he said, I can't do this. And at that time period, he went to Tennessee, and he was either an engineer or superintendent of an iron foundry in Tennessee. Well, I promised you a love story. I was reading through all of this stuff. I've got diaries, I've got letters, and plus, back there you can see some of the books I brought with me, every biography I could find of Woodrow Wilson. And I was falling in love with this man. And then I was looking through these letters, just reading along. Then I found a letter that he wrote to his sister Ellen. And I'm going to tell you something this afternoon, which I suppose will be a great surprise to you. I wanted to tell you before, but for reasons which I will explain later, have not done so. It is this. Florence Leach, my Boston friend, and I are engaged. Florence Leach, you can see her holding the violin back there. Edward and her lived in the same boarding house when he was at MIT. Edward often in his diaries mentioned that he would not talk to girls because his stutter was worse talking to girls. But he meets Florence, and he's plagued with the fact that he's eating every meal just about with Florence because they're in the same boarding house. She was a violinist in Boston. She traveled Europe with the Boston Orchestra, and she traveled around the United States playing her violin. In his letter, he tells his sister the reason he didn't mention Florence to her is because he'd fallen in love with her, but he knew it was an impossible dream because he did not ever want to tie anybody and have anybody else plagued with his stutter. But Florence had had polio when she was young, and Florence limped. I haven't heard it seen it written anywhere that she walked with a cane, but in all my conjuring up of all this, I picture this beautiful woman sitting at the table, across the table from her, but then when she stands up, she has to reach for a cane. But I have read the writing, the fact that she limped from polio from when she was younger. And what he wrote to Ellen about it was that Florence is the one that convinced him. She told him if he can handle her limp, she can handle his stutter. And that there was no difference between the two. And he also told her that since he was all alone in Tennessee at this iron foundry, and he had her on his mind all the time, that he felt like he must have her living with him. So they were married in Boston. Woodrow and Ellen were not able to come to their wedding because their daughter was in the hospital sick. They came to visit Woodrow's daughter on their honeymoon the next day after their wedding. And he wrote Woodrow's daughter twice during their honeymoon. And so I thought that was pretty neat to see that connection. And she joined him in Tennessee and lived with him in Tennessee. While they were living in Tennessee, another famous name pops up. I run across a letter that Edward was writing to his brother, dated 1903. And, or 1902. And in this letter, Dear Stock, 1901, November 12th, 1901. My dear Stock, his brother was Stockton Axon. Your letter which arrived a day ago with the enclosure from Mrs. Edison has made me do a good deal of thinking. Thomas Edison offered Edward a job up in the Menlo Park. The invention factory, I think is what I wanted to say. Edward had this huge institute in Menlo Park. He offered Edward a job to come up. Well, Edward and Florence went up to New Jersey. At this time period, Woodrow Wilson's at Princeton. They'd been away from him all of that time. They were expecting their first baby. So the temptation for Menlo Park was probably pretty significant. The next I see in the writing was Ellen writing a letter to her friend. She said that Edward and Florence came to visit them, and he had solved in 2 weeks the problem that Thomas Edison needed solving that other people had worked on for years. And so he had been at Menlo Park, he had been working with Thomas Edison, he was successful in doing what they needed him to do. Then they returned to Tennessee. And the next writing I found with the mention of Thomas Edison was that Edward wrote to his sister that he had been contemplating the job offer he had from Thomas Edison. But he had decided there was more future in gold than there is in electricity. So he and Florence had decided that they were going to move to Georgia. So about 1902, 1903, Florence and Edward and their baby moved to Georgia. And we're living in the home that my mom lives in, and he was the superintendent of the mines. My mom and I often batter around between us how welcoming my great-grandparents and their neighbors were of this Georgia-born boy, but he grew up north with a brother-in-law that was the president of Princeton University coming in to boss them around. The only clue I have as to how welcoming they were, I ran across just a year ago. I was helping my daughter move into college, and I ran across my cousin that I'd known all my life, and her son was moving into college. And I noticed his name was Axon. And I looked at her and I said, where did you get his name? She said, he's named for my grandfather. Her grandfather was my great-grandfather's brother, Uncle Hoyt. Hoyt Green. His name was Hoyt Axon Green. Well, Edward Axon's mother's maiden name was Hoyt. And so somehow my Greens had talked to the Axons well enough to where that name came out in my family. And my Uncle Hoyt was born just a year after the end of this love story. On a spring day in April. I've heard different reports, but the one that sounds the best for me was Edward and Florence went to a baseball game. I picture the Latham Mules. Could be over here in Ball Ground, but they had gone to a baseball game. Edward played baseball on it wasn't the official Princeton team, but his freshman year he played for they had class teams and then they had the school team. He played for his class team. So they were going to a baseball game that was the miners from the Franklin Mines playing against someone. And they were returning from that game, and the river was up like it is often in the spring. And he had 2 horses hitched to the carriage that had never pulled a carriage together. I've got one really interesting account that I'm going to go to. His cousin Nene lived in Atlanta, Georgia. At the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library, amidst all the papers, I pull out this date book. It looks like it's garbage. It was like one of those date books that you have sitting on your desk that nobody has anymore because we use our cell phones now. They have 2 holes in them that are bound together. It was 1 page from that date book pulled out. At the top she had opera and the time. But written over all of that, she had the following written. Dorothy came this morning at 4:30. We went to the opera. EJB, which is her husband, Edward Brown, joined us there. Came home after hearing the wonderful first act. To be told that a telephone messages had come announcing that Edward Axon, Florence, his wife, and little Edward have drowned at Creighton. EJB went at once to town to get the undertaker's man, and I threw a few things into a balance, and the big boys took me to meet him at the 8:50 train, which we had just time to make. Sent the boys back to hear Parsifal. Also Auntie and Dorothy and Mamie took Esther to fill my place. Reached Ball Ground at 11:30. Drove to Creighton, arriving at 2:00 a.m. So left Atlanta at 8:50, got to Ball Ground 11:30, went by carriage from Ball Ground to Creighton, 15-minute drive maybe now, and got there at 2:00 in the morning. To find Minnie and Miss Emma, I'm assuming that's Edward's servants, with several neighbors waiting at the house where the 3 dead lay very peacefully, their brief agony over. They were driving Cezanina, Cezanina, and Rhoda. They lost control of them at the ferry, and the horses plunged into the flat and off into the water at the other end. Edward died a hero, holding Florence in one arm and the baby in the other. The 2 men who stood helplessly on the bank saw him each time he sank, raise them to hold them above the water until strength and consciousness were gone. No signs of distress or terror shone on any of their faces. Edward was magnificent, like a statue of courage. The baby, like a heavenly being, or a Pannon marble, not like anything human. We left Creighton at noon, reached Atlanta at 8:00 this evening. Went down to Patterson's establishment, Patterson's and Son, at 8 to choose caskets and robe for Florence and baby. Ordered flowers, spent the time till 11:00 at Edward's office writing to Ellen, Woodrow Wilson's wife. Drove to the station, Ed Brown, and she lists a whole other list, left by train at noon. Palmer Axon of Savannah is also in attendance. And then she put very tired. Sitting there looking at that, written in her date book on the day that it happened, and picturing Edward. The accounts, I found several different accounts, but the best account I found was in his college, they have a college alumni book where people would write in reports. They wrote that the man that was sitting on the bank was fishing with his grandson. Neither of them could swim. So they sent the grandson to sound an alarm from the mines. Every biography I found of Ellen describes her going into a breakdown right after that. She writes letters to her friends, and she never says, "My brother died." She says, "My boy. My boy died in Georgia. My boy passed away." Woodrow Wilson took Ellen up to Connecticut to an artist colony. And she was a painter. And she totally submerged herself in painting. And that's what they say was what pulled her out from her boy dying in Creighton, Georgia. Okay, I had all this, and I finally knew that Edward and Florence and baby Edward had lived in my mother's house. But can anybody guess what my next question was? Did Woodrow Wilson visit? And that was the next thing I just had to find out. And I didn't find this out. I've been researching for about 10 years. And I was on a ski trip with some friends from church. And I realized that the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library, that I had been looking at information that they had online, because they have a virtual archives, was not far from the area in Virginia that we were skiing. So I drove an hour's drive to this library to, again, dig through papers that had been thrown into boxes that weren't indexed, that I didn't know what I was going to find. And what I found in a letter, 2 different letters. The first one was Ellen writing a letter thanking her cousins for the letter of condolences after Edward died. And in that letter she mentioned that she was very thankful that she had gone to visit him last February, and that he had raved about how much her mother had helped him and Florence out when he lived in Tennessee and their baby was born. And she wanted to tell this cousin how much her mother had meant to her. Okay, so I know that Ellen Axon visited Edward. She didn't say in his home in that one. So that's not enough. Then on over in the same day of digging through boxes, I found another letter that Ellen Axon wrote to the lawyer that was handling Edward's estate. And she said, when I was in his hall in Creighton, I noticed he had a picture I had painted of a sunset over a marsh hanging on the wall in his hall. I want that picture to go to Cousin Minnie. So I got Ellen Wilson in my mother's hall in Creighton, Georgia, looking at a picture that if I ever see it in a museum, we're going to have a national treasure incident of me trying to get that picture. But I still didn't know if she was alone. So then I started going through biographies of Woodrow Wilson to see where he was on that day, reading letters he's writing to people, and seeing what he was doing. Well, the year Edward died, Edward died in April. Ellen visited him in February. The December before that, Woodrow Wilson had hernia surgery. And he went to Florida to recuperate from his hernia surgery. And he and his wife Ellen were in Florida recuperating. They returned to Princeton in late February. So, as best I can connect 1, 2, and 3, they were traveling from Florida to Princeton when they stopped off to see Edward. I still can't say Woodrow Wilson stood on this place in my mama's home, but I feel like he did. And the best love story of all of this is not really Edward and Florence, although his writings, he was madly in love with her. And the fact that they both died together totally ended that line, because their only child drowned with them. That's not really the love story. The love story my husband would tell you is what's going on with his wife and this ghost that tends to haunt her. My daughter will say, "Mom, if you tell me one more thing that Edward said, I'm going to not even listen to you ever again." This picture, the baby looks so much like the same age as the picture on my mom's steps. They're right there, that's the one. My mom's steps do not look like that anymore because my grandfather tore them down in the 1950s.
We rebuilt them, huh?
Yeah, and they're concrete steps, and they're not nearly that steep. But it looks so much in age that I really feel like Florence holding the baby up could have been in Mom's house.
That's his uncle.
That's his uncle, Warren Brown, who raised this baby's aunt, Edward's baby sister. Warren was one of the owners of the Franklin mine. But there's the Woodrow Wilson connection to Ball Ground, Georgia. Questions, if we have time?
You might want to bring up the fact that the ferry that was put in in use was early with John Moore. They call it Moore's Ferry. It was after the dam, so the whole bottoms across the north side of the river was like a lake.
So this ferry would be crossing a lake.
So it was different from what the river you know today. When the horses went into that, it was a great expanse of water to try to swim through.
For the dam, they backed up, so that the river was not level with the top of the banks, so you didn't have to go down and you didn't cross the river. You just crossed the river where it was backed up.
Yeah.
About
There was a dam on the river.
10 years ago, I started putting all this together into a book. Because my husband kept saying, if Nicholas Spark gets a hold of that, you're in trouble, because in all of his books, everybody dies. And my hardest dilemma, and I know, Bob's, you've written a book, haven't you? Was the voice. What voice is going to tell the story? Because Edward's writing is totally different from the way I talk. He was a Princeton educated, lived most of his life up north. But I wanted to do that justice. And then I realized the voice I heard in my mind was my grandmother's. So finally I got a handle of things. Of the basis of the book is my doing research and bringing things back to her. And then my grandmother telling me the story, or reading between the lines of the documents I bring to her. And that's the only way I can hear the story, is to hear it from my grandmother's voice, who never knew anything about Edward Axon.
I have always heard that the mine, there was a cave-in of the river into the mine, and that's what stopped the production.
I finally found the date of the cave-in. It was before the last meeting. I went and I was digging through records at the Atlanta History Center, of all places. And it was in 1907 is when that cave-in happened. And the interesting about that, it said that they didn't want to publicize the cave-in. That's why I wasn't finding it recorded in newspapers and different things like I always thought it would, because there was a run on the bank of Ball Ground after the cave-in, because the socks for the mine were handled through the bank of Ball Ground. And they mentioned the Panic of 1907. And I thought, okay, that's the mine's going out of business. No, the Panic of 1907 was the run on the bank that was caused by the collapse of the mines. And what had happened was there's a tunnel that goes under the river. And the top of, tunnel. The top of the tunnel cracked, and the river started filling up the tunnel. And every story I've heard, it was during lunch and the miners were out. No one was hurt. And the miners were out eating their lunch, but they heard a boom, like an earthquake or a bolt of big thunder. And then the water stood still in the river and began flowing backwards.
I've
From
heard
where
that
it
even
filled
to
it up.
Canton. I have heard that the water flew backwards even from Canton.
And from what we've got to go back to the Atlanta History Center, because what I found there is another special collection, and it's the documents from the Franklin gold mines. And it still isn't indexed, it's all thrown into boxes. It was 5 different boxes of documents that I found there. And I was just scanning for any trace, and it was Panic 1907 is what got my attention on that one document. But I've got to go and read the rest of the documents. But it looked like they tried to salvage the mines. And it wasn't until like 1911 or 1912 that they finally gave up on gold mining and put all of their interest in mining pyrite. Because it would be more money repairing the damage that was done than they would be able to recoup. Yes?
On the Etowah, there's an old iron bridge when you go down it, if you're floating in it. It's pretty messed up. It's not, it's just remnants. Now, where Edward and his family met their fate, is that north or south of that?
It's upstream
It's upstream.
from there. There's a section upstream, and Daddy, you can tell me if I'm wrong, because you're the one that pointed it out to me, where you can see a level area on both sides of the river, and that's where the ferry crossing is. And then the ferry was replaced by that iron bridge. When my mother and Vivian grew up on the mine, they would cross over that iron bridge. And I've heard horror stories about that to get to their house. And then the iron bridge was replaced in the
1962, I think.
62 or 63.
Yeah, I was
Well,
gonna say early 60s.
by the current Yellow Creek Road Bridge.
Yeah.
Oh, I remember it because Danny used to.
If you floated the river, the rapids that you could go into before the islands, do you know what I'm talking about? You'll
Below
come
that
down,
bridge,
downstream from that bridge.
the
Upstream.
rock formations were the dam.
Those were the dam.
Okay.
And there's a picture here where you can see the dam.
How far upstream from the bridge is that?
The dam,
Current-
you can see it
current
from the
bridge.
bridge.
It's probably about 200 yards
Okay,
above the bridge, where the bridge crosses the river now.
okay.
You're
It's-
talking about the Yellow Creek Bridge, right?
Yeah.
The Yellow Creek
Yeah.
Bridge,
Yellow Creek
upstream from the Yellow Creek Bridge, there's sort of a series of islands.
Hmm.
About 3 islands, depending on how much the river's up.
Okay,
And then you have a rocky area. Some people will say it's shoals. It's not shoals, it's the old dams.
It's the old dam.
And that dam was built in the 1840s by Widow Franklin.
so you had the dam, and then you had the water backed up, and then you had the crossing.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the ferry was at. Was
The
in
ferry was a good bit above where the dam was. It's on around the curve.
Oh, okay.
It's way on up the river.
Dad, is the ferry between where Setting Down Creek runs into the river and where the iron bridge is?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and at one time, you could
Where-
stand on the hill on the north side and see the indention where the old road
Old
went
road,
down.
Where it
Okay.
runs
Through
down
the
to
farm
Carson
on the
River.
north side and down to the river. And then on the other side, where most of the mining shafts were, you have a high bank on that side.
2 interesting facts about the dam. A lot of people around that area for years did not own the mineral rights or the rights to the water
Right.
on their property. And it's because when the gold mines went out of business, they sold off the property that was the gold mines. They kept the property that was the pyrite mines. But they kept all rights to the river, to the power generated to the dam and the power plant. And then they kept all mineral rights too.
That was.
And that power plant was used to power the pyrite mines. And they also, in some records we saw that our latest discovery was that they sold power. It was a power generating company at that time.
So the land there now, the people that own it don't have the mineral rights.
Some do. Some have managed to get it bought,
But
but
some
some
don't.
don't.
It's been
And who, I'm sorry.
a
Who is it that
controversial
still
subject for
owns
years
It's-
and years.
Because of
It's,
all the,
it is the most complicated spider web I think I have ever encountered.
because of
The whole shifting and
the
everything.
mines and the
Right.
and where they.
The other interesting thing about the dam is when the architect looked at my mom's house, there's places in the wall where you could see the previous wire work. My grandfather rewired the whole house when he restored it in the 1950s. But the architect was looking at the wiring and he said, where did they get power? That the dating of the wiring of the house is older than any of the houses he's seen in North Georgia. And he said, how on earth did they get power to run through this
From the mines.
wiring? And it was
From the
from
mines.
that dam on the mines.
There's little, what do you call it, agate conductors here and there in the upstairs,
Oh, wow.
yeah. And as far as.
At the time this was built, nobody's drilling houses that were away from there had electricity. The mines had the electricity.
Right.
So the electricity from the mines went to the house that we live in now.
Oh, okay.
Well, it also helped with pyrite
Yeah,
drills and all
yeah,
that.
yeah.
It's pretty interesting.
And all that is, yes,
The
that,
more you
yeah.
dig into the surveys and the reports and correspondence and within our own courthouse in minute books, there's a lot of periods of time where employees claim they weren't being paid correctly and they would sue to get right payment. It's goes on and on.
That's necessity is the mother of invention. So, when you, what you
Yes.
need is, you come up with.
I was gonna say, also in the study of the bank, there was a bank that's called the Bank of Ball Ground, and in 1907, it sold to Ball Ground Bank.
Which
And
would be the
then-
same time period.
Right, same time period. And then, the Ball Ground Bank went bankrupt in 1926, and then that's when Citizens Bank was formed. But that 1907. is
One
what the
interesting
result
letter
was.
that we encountered was when they were trying to keep from going under after the collapse of the main mine shaft. Their lawyer sent them a letter saying that he could no longer represent them if they continued the financial manipulation that they were doing with their stocks.
So you think this
So-
sale was some sort
so
of,
The way
Trying to
they were
protect
doing,
assets.
I feel like they were selling more stocks than they had, and not accurately representing to their stockholders that they were doing this.
uh-huh.
And that was an interesting thing. There was definitely a desperation.
The Cherokee Advance through the years, at that time published articles about northern capitalists. Some of them were kind of famous coming down to look the scene over, thinking about investing. And that's where Creighton really came from, Pennsylvania, that bought into it and started mining pyrite.
And even Edward coming from New Jersey, instead of going to work for Thomas Edison, because there's more of a future in gold than electricity.
That's something, yes.
But you know that, in Florida, there's a Pasco County.
Mhm.
Is that related?
I haven't found the connection. I haven't. Yes.
Now, this is a little off topic, but it talks about, it's not mica, what were you talking about? No, not mica.
Pyrite?
Barry,
Over, Mica,
They went from gold mining to what now?
Pyrite.
Barry.
Yeah. Okay, I don't know where I got mica
a
from.
lot of minerals.
Well,
were
there is a lot of
involved.
mica.
Well, no, it probably had to do with the agate, or
Uh-huh.
with the insulators in the old wiring, and I was thinking mica was an insulator, and you find it everywhere, and I don't remember what we're talking about. But anyway, we went on Crichton Road after last month's thing, because there were two pyrite mines along that way.
Yeah.
Now, what I was looking for was like slag heaps or disturbances of the earth, because on the old mines, you just throw it everywhere. You can find it all up in North Georgia, and down on the slag heaps down on Stamps Creek where the furnace is over there in Pine Log. You see the disturbances of the earth, it's not natural. And I could have sworn, remember we drove by that, I said, those hills don't look normal. They were,
There is still,
is there,
there
do you
is,
know of scars that are there, and how far was it off Crichton Road, the mill, the
one
manufacturing facility?
artifact still left from the pyrite mines is not far from, but I wouldn't advise because it's private property.
No, I know it says private property. I mean,
But
they
there is
spent the
still
$2 on it.
concrete foundations out there of buildings from the pyrite mines. And then also, there was an entire town, Dad was talking about it on the way here,
Oh,
called Blaketown,
Look,
because one of the owners of the pyrite mines' name was Blake. And it's, if you were turned down Creighton Road from 372, because Creighton Road goes from 372 to 369, and you're traveling towards 369, there's an area to your right that's wooded, that out in there, when my dad was little, was a ghost town. That he could go and look at it. I doubt if anything's left from it now.
Ghost town.
Dad, tell them about Blaketown.
You gotta tell us about
Blake
that.
Town. Well, it's are you familiar with this area that you're talking about now?
No.
Daddy, stand up, because they're videotaping you.
Well, Blake Town is it was off of the main road. It goes by the house that we used to live in. Is a road that turns off. It's an old dirt road. You go off of that road and you come up to the top of the hill there. Nothing else is around anywhere. And you turn back and there's a line of buildings right down through that, store buildings. And you got wooden sidewalks all the way down. There's about 5 or 6 of them in a row from one end to the other. Nobody lives there.
This
But
is
they're
in the
still there.
19,
Well,
40s,
there was
probably.
really young.
Yeah, when I was young, it was
Yeah.
still there. But it was called Blake Town.
Blake town?
Blake Town.
Okay.
It's not there now.
Lucille, do you know where he's talking about?
Yes, I do.
You,
I live right there. in
hey,
the
Blake
corner.
Town?
No, it's on Creighton Road.
Okay.
Right across from Creighton Road.
Okay.
Across from Frank.
Right, across from Frankie's.
Frankie,
And
okay.
there is an opening, an old shaft opening on Creighton Road on past Frankie's house
Uh-huh.
on the left, but it's off the road and it is on private property. But it is a hole in the ground
Mhm.
and, with the,
Their mining was really different from the
They-
gold
they-
shafts, gold mine shafts.
They would just go down somewhere and mine out, but they didn't make no tunnels. Yeah, we
Pit
have
mines.
a lot of them up there now.
Pit mine,
Pit mining.
we got a lot of pits on our property where they started doing the
Only
pit.
the pyrite mine closed.
And then we got one that's
That's my
got a
next
hole
thing
in
to
the tunnel
figure out.
inside.
I'm pretty sure it was close to the end of World War One, because World War One's what generated the demand for pyrite.
That was down.
It was first used for fertilizer, and then they were using it for gunpowder. And when I read that, I thought about every time there's a bombing, they're looking for somebody buying a bunch of fertilizer. So that's, but I feel like it's close to the end of World War One. But I've got to find proof.
I know my daddy, he hauls pyrite
That's what my great-grandfather did.
to the railroad.
They hauled a lot of pyrite down to the railroads here in Ballew.
In fact, another thing that was really interesting, they tried very hard to get a railroad line built from ball ground up to the mines. And there was a lot of record of trying to get railroad investors to support this building. And it was surveyed. I've seen it recorded in several different places. They were surveying it even in the mid-1800s. When was Ball Ground founded?
1883.
Because that was about the time the railroad went through.
Right.
And when the railroad went through, there was on the survey to have a spur going up to the mines. But they could never get the investors to make it happen.
Margaret, wasn't they a Michael mine on y'all's property over there?
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
a Michael mine over there on my mother's.
I always assumed that's where the name Formica came from.
You know, they use them a lot in electric, as for electrical insulation.
I was trying to think of the man, he was from Germany, that he opened that Michael mine back in the late forties and on into fifties. And his brother got killed over there, down in that, one of those mines.
You have his name?
What was that man's name? He lived here in Ball Ground.
My grandfather,
Here in Ball Ground.
in Cherry Grove community.
Yes.
My grandfather sold that property in the early 40s. William Greenberry Cochran was his name. And they were all kind of pit mines for Michael on his farm when he sold it. He moved out here on the Green farm. My grandmother.
Jesse Green Farm?
I'm not sure, I just always said Green farm.
Okay.
And He lived there, and he rented from D and Lurleen Holcomb.
Okay.
But I remember those pits, cause my grandfather always told us to watch where we walked.
I grew up hearing you don't get near any holes. That there was like a monster in it that was going to swallow you up.
The green place is the big house down Flat Bottom.
Dr. Jesse Green.
My grandfather rented that again, and sold them out.
There's a beautiful cemetery over there.
His
Yeah,
family.
Nancy Green.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
What year was that?
Does anybody, thank you so much for having us, and I'm sorry I get on tangents and.
Well, thank you, we sure appreciate it.
We certainly think you a lot of history there, and I hope everybody enjoyed the meeting tonight, and hope you'll come back and be with us again. Next month, I think will be really interesting when the Stancils come. A lot of history here with the Stancils too, and so we thank all you visitors for coming and being with us tonight also, and hope you'll come back and be with us again. We've got some freshmen.
And join us.
And join us. We do. They're right there on the podium. Vivian's got a little something for you all to take back with you in appreciation. And we'll also do Jenny's in charge. Well, I just say Jenny's in charge, but she's part of our local garden club, and we've got commemorative bricks, and we'll do one to honor each of you for your participation in our program. So if you'll fill those out and give them back to Jenny, we'll have a brick in your honor out in our botanical garden out there. So, oh, did you? Oh, okay. Well, with that being said, again, thanks again. We've got refreshments out in the lobby. Get you something to eat, drink, and fellowship one with the other, and enjoy your time together. We'll see you again next time.